Hi, I'm Jacob Horngberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and this is this week's issue of the Libertarian Angle, the show that brings you the libertarian perspective on the burning issues of the day. The Future of Freedom Foundation, its mission is to present the principled case for libertarianism. And Richard, you're my co-host, Richard Ebeling from the Citadel, teaches economics there. Good to see you again.
It's good to see you and our viewers and listeners. Thank you for joining us.
Yeah. Okay, Richard. So the Justice Department has finally come out into the open and indicted Julian Assange for violating what's called the Espionage Act, which would seem to imply spying, but it's kind of difficult to see what Assange did to spy. What he's being charged with is revealing the truth about the inner workings of the national security state, including some of the grave wrongdoing engaged in by the national security state. And I guess they call that espionage, spying on it, that he's revealing their dark inner secrets, even though what he's revealed is truthful. But, you know, the mainstream press is now finally catching on that this is a big threat to the mainstream press, because all he has done is just disclose information that he received about the inner workings of the national security establishment, which is effectively what the press did with the Pentagon Papers and what the press often does with secrets that are revealed to it by insiders like Edward Snowden. So they're finally coming to the defense of Assange based on this principle that, hey, this is a threat to the press generally. But as is customary, they all are operating in this statist box that accepts the status quo, accepts the way things are, and they just can't ever break out of this box under which we find ourselves with the welfare state, the warfare state, the national security state. And breaking out of that box necessarily entails something higher, something bigger. And that would be not pleading with the Justice Department to please show leniency here with respect to Assange, or don't enforce the law too harshly here. Thinking at a higher level involves calling for a repeal of the Espionage Act. And that's what I want to bring up in the show today is what are we doing with this law? I mean, this is a relic of World War I. And you and I have talked about World War I. We devoted a segment to it. I mean, this was at least the U.S. intervention was absolutely lunatic. It was an act of lunacy. There was no reason for the U.S. to intervene in that war. It contradicted America's heritage of non-intervention in foreign wars. Wilson wanted to intervene to save the world for democracy and to make the world make this the war to end all wars, and it was a total fiasco. I mean, the total defeat of Germany, which the U.S. intervention brought about, just gave rise to Hitler and World War II, which was really just a continuation of World War I. But in 2 months after we entered this war, Wilson gets Congress to enact the Espionage Act, which had two features to it. It criminalized the disclosure of information relating to national secrets, the Department of War's secrets, and the other one was criticizing the conscription, which I would call the enslavement of American men that were being forced to wage this war. Now, my position is that when you got to force citizens to wage a war, that's a pretty good sign that that's a bad war. But I mean, here there were people who were just criticizing the draft, criticizing the government. In fact, they even passed, as part of the Espionage Act, shortly after that, a law that just criminalized criticizing the government. It was a sedition law. It was incredible. How do you reconcile this with the principles of a free society? And in fact, they went after people for encouraging soldiers not to comply with the draft, which is really just a variation of slavery, like I said. and for criticizing the war. One of them was a guy named Charles Schenck, another guy with Eugene Debs. They went after them with a vengeance for daring to criticize what President Wilson was doing. And once the war is over, and they went after him, they convicted him, they sent him up for long jail terms. Those weren't the only two. There were many others. And when the war was over, they got rid of the Sedition Act, but they kept the Espionage Act, and it's been with us ever since. And so I say, let's bury this World War I intervention. I mean, it was one of the worst mistakes in U.S. history. It's time to acknowledge that. And one of the best ways to acknowledgement is to ditch the entire Espionage Act. It's a World War I dinosaur that has been used so many times since then to go after people, not for spying, but for revealing the dark secrets of the national security state. What do you think?
Well, I think that just to reiterate some of the points that you made, what this is basically meant to do, in spite of the wording of the Espionage Act, it is to prevent individuals from, guided by their conscience or what others have shared to them, either intentionally or unintentionally, truths about what their own U.S. government is doing. Now, of course, the government wants to claim that the type of information that was released through WikiLeaks by him threatened to revealing the identities of Secret Service agents, diplomats on serious secret missions, and so on. But the fact is, what they're really objecting to is that he revealed things that the U.S. government didn't want the general public to know, that did not involve placing American soldiers in greater than usual harm's way in a combat situation, is not giving like aerial photos of supply lines and logistic data. It was just basically information informing the citizenry about what the United States government had done and was doing in these Middle Eastern wars, concerning strategy, purpose, intention, actions that the government itself chose not to share, at least not completely, with the U.S. population, even though that the agents of the government are supposed to be responsible to the voters who elect them and to have a high and wide degree of transparency. Now, the idea that someone looks behind the curtain, to use the analogy from The Wizard of Oz, don't look behind the curtain, that someone has looked behind the curtain and says what's going on behind the curtain, and that this might create a negative effect, not on putting soldiers in danger, but to negatively affect the politicians and the bureaucrats to who are responsible to the American public in an embarrassing or in a contradictory way about what they're doing and why they're doing it, for which they have not received direct consent, certainly not in the public opinion polls or by acts or legislation of Congress. So this is basically a way of controlling what the people know to serve the interests of the state. Now, if I can make an analogy, Jacob, today is June 4th. Now, this is the 40th anniversary, the 30th anniversary of Tiananmen Square. That is when there were thousands of young Chinese students in Tiananmen Square in the center of Beijing, protesting and calling for democracy. Maybe some viewers and listeners who are old enough remember the live coverage of the demonstrations there and how they had created a Chinese version of the Statue of Liberty to symbolize their desire for a freer society, and how suddenly the feed line went black, and that is when the Chinese People's Liberation Army went in and proceeded to slaughter, and the numbers are not known, certainly hundreds, maybe thousands of these student protesters, and crush this movement that the Communist Party viewed as a threat to their legitimacy and power as the monopoly governmental authority. Now, ever since then, and the papers have been pointing this out, There was an article in the Wall Street Journal this weekend, the New York Times this weekend, for instance, of how they are censoring through their versions of social media or access to archival materials, either in buildings or online, anything relating to this. And if you try to speak about it, write about it, reveal it, share information about it, you are subject to being taken into custody by the Chinese secret police, interrogated, threatened, maybe imprisoned. Now, if the Chinese government does this about what they did in Tiananmen Square 30 years ago, what is the response by most Americans and even our political leaders? This shows what an oppressive, tyrannical government they are. They not only killed people, but they've tried to erase that episode from the pages of Chinese history so as not to question their legitimacy, their right, their authority, and their power. This is shocking. What happened to freedom of information? What happened to freedom of the press? Yet when some information about certainly questionable foreign policy decisions and policies are made and implemented, and information is shared with the American public, what is the response by the powers that be in the United States? This is a threat to national security. This is undermining the legitimacy of the United States government. This puts American diplomatic and espionage personnel in danger. We should decide what the public needs and should know, not private sources of information. How are we any better than the communist government? If someone in China attempted to do what WikiLeaks did, and the WikiLeaks founder, okay, that person would disappear into a black hole and never be seen again. And we would be horrified. But our leaders are doing it, and we're the good guys, and we wear the white hat. And if we have to put someone in a deep, dark dungeon forever under these charges of espionage, well, it's good for America, and it's the right thing to do. In my opinion, this guy is a hero. This guy is attempting to look behind that curtain and tell the American people and the world, because WikiLeaks has not just done this stuff about the US government, they've done it about other governments. And the underhanded violations of civil liberties, private property rights, protections of privacy. They've told this about other governments, okay? But notice, and one more thing, Jacob, which is important. He wasn't a spy. He's not a U.S. citizen. He merely shared information given to him and asked his source for more information. What do you think Bernstein did during the Watergate business with Deep Throat? Oh, thank you for this information, but even though you might be able to give me more, I wouldn't think of asking you for more. Of course they did, okay? Of course they did. This is what reporters do. They bring to the surface, in the light, that which governments are trying to hide in the ground where it cannot be seen, in the vaults, behind the closed doors, in the smoke-filled rooms. Okay, this guy is a hero. And like Snowden, who now has to sit in exile in Moscow, they are condemned and threatened with life imprisonment. In principle, espionage, even though he's not a U.S. citizen, he could be executed, right? That's a capital offense if the case is presented a certain way. This is a travesty of justice, an attempt to throttle freedom of the press and the right of a free citizenry to know what its own government is doing, and is setting a precedent that should rightly send a chill down the back of not only those in the field of journalism, but to every right-thinking and informed American citizen about how this will attempt to shut the mouths of people who want to do nothing more than to tell their fellow citizens and citizens of the world the truth about what their own government and other governments are doing.
Yeah, and I think it's important to point out that the Justice Department is justifying its prosecution of Assange by saying, well, he's not a real journalist. Well, this doesn't turn on who is a journalist and who isn't a journalist. Anybody's got the right to publish any of the dark secrets of the national security state. You and I have that right, and it doesn't turn on whether you and I meet the technical definition of a journalist. Any citizen's got the right to do this. And you're right about using the Wizard of Oz as the analogy here, because not only did the WikiLeaks revelations show the wrongdoing, the grave wrongdoing, like that helicopter attack where they're attacking people and sort of cackling about how they're doing it and the people they're firing and what's happening to the bodies and that there's children there, and it was just this total indifference. And that's what they really hate, is for people to see exactly how these forever wars are being managed and run. But it's also the WikiLeaks revelation showed just how the sausage is getting made. You know, emails between diplomats, and you're seeing exactly what goes on, all the darkness as these bureaucrats start getting together and managing the world. And the whole thing, your analogy about Tiananmen Square is fantastic too, because when I think about this, I think of my favorite story in history is the story of the White Rose. And this was a group of German college students who, in the middle of World War II, decided to start taking on their own government. And they start publishing pamphlets secretly, surreptitiously around Germany, called the White Rose, that called on Germans to oppose their government in time of war and to not support the troops. Now, when we look at this, Americans look at this and we say, oh, how heroic. And it was heroic. There's a great movie called Sophie Scholl, The Final Days, that I highly recommend. I've got my essay that I'm really proud of. It's my favorite essay in the 29 years I've been writing. That's my favorite essay. And it's called The White Rose, A Lesson in Dissent. And you can find it on the internet. But, you know, Americans look at this and U.S. officials look at this and say, oh, yes, those were heroic students. But the fact is that when they were brought up on trial and they got caught, the German judge took the same position that U.S. officials take with respect to Assange and Schenck and Debs and other people that are prosecuted under the Espionage Act, that they were bad Germans, they were bad citizens. You know, imagining encouraging citizens not to support the troops. They called them traitors, and they executed them for being traitors. So U.S. officials would look at that situation and say, oh, well, those were heroes. But the fact is that if the Scholl siblings had been here in the United States during World War I doing the exact same thing, they would have been sent away, if not executed, under the Espionage Act. And so it's always easy to look at people who are resisting and disclosing the secrets of a bad regime or a regime that's doing bad things and look at them as heroic. It's not so easy to do so with respect to the dissidents here. And you're right. People like Assange and Ed Snowden, they're heroes. They're heroes of our times because they're willing to do what the White Rose people did. They're willing to take a principled stand against the wrongdoing of their own government and risk their own personal safety and security and well-being to disclose the dark side secrets of the national security state.
Yeah, and again, to use this analogy that I made with China today concerning the Tiananmen Square massacre on June 4th, 1989, why is the Chinese government doing this? And again, these articles that I said appeared this past weekend in the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times, both emphasizing what is the Chinese government attempting to do and why in this matter. They want to control the history. They want their citizens to only know what the government wants. That is, what serves the interests of those in the Communist Party who control the country. This is the official interpretation. This is the permitted and relevant facts. This is the heroic story of what your government is doing in all ways, shapes, and forms that are always considered to be good, right, just, necessary. Does an occasional blemish or pimple occur? Even a perfect person may have a bad day of a complexion problem. But he is a hero. He's doing good for his nation. Now, we're shocked by this. Government mandating or central planning the history for indoctrination of its population. But is this not what the U.S. government is attempting to do, to suppress, hide, and prevent information and knowledge about their own actions? It's the same thing. Look, our viewers and listeners know that, like yourself, I'm far from being a Trump fan. If anything, the exact opposite. But isn't this the game that the Democrats are playing? Oh, the Russians were giving information to sources like WikiLeaks or others indirectly, and they told what Hillary Clinton was doing to Bernie Sanders' attempt to compete against her for the Democratic nomination. Deception, manipulation, distortion, backstabbing. We should want to know that. And if such information was revealed about the inner workings of the power plays within the Republican Party, good. All curtains should be looked behind, and all men behind the curtain should be seen for what they really are. Republican, Democrat, left, right, up and down, in the middle, confused. It doesn't matter. They either have or they're attempting to gain the reins of political power, and therefore influencing each of our destinies through the ultimate coercive power of government. Anything they do. However, the purpose and wherefore needs to be known by the American citizenry. So I don't care whether it was done by the Russians or whoever did. I'm happy to know that Hillary Clinton is a backstabbing, manipulating, conniving, intriguing power luster against the people of her own party, just like she wants to screw everybody else in the country. And I think the American people should know that. And I consider that a good, not something to be, private emails, private. I wish that if there had been the internet in the 1930s, we could have a revelation of what would have been Hitler's private emails, or maybe his tweets.
Well, yeah, I think it's also important to point out that the destruction of liberty that comes with the Espionage Act comes also with this turn toward foreign empire and intervention. That, remember, America was founded on a non-interventionist foreign policy, don't get involved in these foreign wars, and a limited government republic. Well, that starts to change as the 20th century gets going, and so it's revealing that here this major intervention into World War I is accompanied by this massive destruction of liberty, this Espionage Act. But that's just setting the stage for the conversion of the federal government after World War II, which was a continuation of World War I, into a national security state. And your comparison of China is perfect, because China is a national security state too. So is North Korea, and so is the U.S. government. And so we're dealing also here with a structural problem, that when you have a national security state, you inherently have a tyrannical type of governmental system. It's a totalitarian type of governmental system. Oh, the officials may wear American flags instead of Chinese flags, but it's a structural thing. Everything revolves around the concept of national security. It does here, it does in North Korea, it does in China. That's what happens with a national security state. None of that happens with a limited government republic, because you don't have this whole concept of national security. You don't have all these dark side secrets. There's a transparency in government. You don't have an NSA. You don't have a CIA. You don't have a Pentagon and a military industrial complex. In fact, one of the things that we should take note of is that if the American people had been told after the Constitutional Convention that the Constitution was bringing into existence a federal government that was a national security state, where they could go to jail for revealing the dark side practices of the NSA, the CIA, and the Pentagon, which were all going to be part of this new government, I will guarantee you the American people would never have approved the deal. We would have continued operating under the Articles of Confederation, which they'd been operating under for 13 years, where the federal government didn't even have the power to tax. That's how far we have abandoned the founding principles of this country. And by abandoning that founding principle and of foreign interventionism as well as a national security state, we end up with these kind of dark side practices and the tyrannical prosecution and conviction and punishment or exile of people who dare to reveal these dark side practices. So I would suggest that thinking at a higher level means not only getting rid of the Espionage Act instead of pleading with the Pentagon not to enforce it or to enforce it more leniently. It also involves restoring a foreign policy of non-interventionism and a restoration of a limited government republic and the dismantling of the national security state apparatus.
Yeah, well, there's one other element in this notion of national security as the rationale for utilizing this now over a century-old Espionage Act. And that is, notice what Donald Trump has been saying. We have to impose tariffs as a national security issue. Our jobs, our manufacturing is at risk because of the dangerous, aggressive policies in the global marketplace that have negative impacts on us. We must build a wall, and it's a national security issue. Bad people might be coming into the United States. Well, if tariffs and border barriers are also part of national security, then what happens when some journalist has a source in the White House or in the Treasury or in the State Department or any other government agency, such as the Defense Department, and something is revealed to them about the inner workings of Trump's tariff policy decision-making or Trump's border wall decision-making that the government does not want the people to know? Can we expect that someone would then be arrested and held on charges of espionage because they're violating these aspects of national security? This is like the general welfare and the common good. It sounds nice. Who's not for the general welfare? Who's not for the common good? I mean, even Jacob Hornberger isn't against the general welfare, even Mr. Him. But we all know this is an elastic term that can be stretched, twisted, punched in, popped out in any numerous directions so that it represents and reflects and says anything you want it to. It's a meaning. These are meaningless phrases because there's no content in them. And when you put a content, they become controversial. It's the same thing with national security. Even Jacob Hornberger is concerned about the security of America, rightly understood. But once you get, oh, well, don't you care about the safety of America? Once you get to the specifics, the concrete, what policies, with what purpose, with what means, with what legal authority, on and on and on, then it's no longer the happy, smiley, it's the specific things your own government is doing, and the legitimacy and the justification, both ethically and legally. And once you're at that, you realize that it's not all good, but it can be used by those in power to basically close the mouths and put away anyone who tells the public things that the political authorities don't want that public to know.
Yeah, and let's take it a step further. As you know, Richard, the federal government, specifically the Pentagon and the CIA, now wield the legal authority, fully confirmed by the federal judiciary, to assassinate American citizens. I mean, it's been well established that they have the authority to assassinate foreign citizens, but with the post 9/11 era, it's been established that the U.S. government can assassinate Americans, and this was established by the Anwar al-Awlaki assassination and the assassination of his 16-year-old son. Now, let's assume that the U.S. national security establishment is planning the assassination of an American or even a foreign citizen. They repeatedly tried to assassinate Fidel Castro, for example, the president of Cuba, and somebody inside the national security section of the government decides that he is going to go reveal to that American that they're planning on assassinating him, or to some foreigner they're trying to assassinate him. Can't do that, because if he does it, he is violating the Espionage Act. He has to just let the assassination go forward, even though it's absolute murder in its sheer form. And so it's another example of where they destroy conscience, they destroy morality with this entire system, because what they want to be kept secret is their wrongdoing. If they were doing something right, they wouldn't care if people found out. It's the wrongdoing that they're engaged in that they want to be kept secret. And part of that wrongdoing is assassination, which is just legalized murder. That's why totalitarian communist regimes engage in it. When you look at North Korea, you see their leaders assassinating people. That's what the national security state of the U.S. is involved in, assassination. And when people reveal it, oh, now we're going to go after you. Or torture, another example, that they, when they're torturing people at Abu Ghraib and stuff, the people that reveal those photographs, boy, they're bad people. If it hadn't revealed those photographs, they would have just denied having done those things. That's where they have perverted this sense of conscience and morality with this national security state and this espionage law.
Yeah, and just again, the analogies that we've been making between this, there are people who risk their lives to take and then sneak out photographs of what the Nazis were doing in mass murders in Eastern Europe, against Jews obviously, but others as well, and to smuggle them out to Great Britain and the United States. Now, during the war. Now, the British and U.S. governments chose not to really reveal those, but that's not the context in which I'm reading this. So should those people who wanted to reveal the atrocities of the Nazi regime during the war be viewed as heroes or villains? Certainly the German government and the Gestapo would have viewed them as villains, and any that might have been caught would have paid the ultimate sacrifice for attempting to tell about the horrors that were being perpetrated. But how should we view those people? Risking their lives or giving their lives to reveal the brutality of a tyrannical regime against multitudes of innocent men, women, and children? Hero or villain? The point is that they're viewed heroes by us. The Nazis would have viewed them as enemies of the German people. And how then should we view Americans who are attempting to reveal the truth? Maybe not as dramatic in their mass murder effects, but certainly, as you're saying, droning, planned, approved assassinations of American citizens, attitudes, as you were pointing out, about American military personnel who are reported to be taking delight or joking about targeting and killing innocent people on the ground. How should these be viewed? In my opinion, they are as horrifying and unacceptable in their actions and in their attitudes than what the Nazis did in mass murdering people in Eastern Europe. And anyone who revealed it then as a hero, and those who tell the truth about what the U.S. government does behind those closed doors from the American citizens, should be reviewed as a heroic whistleblower and not an enemy of the state.
Just another example of how we libertarians are trying to raise people's vision to a higher level, one that focuses on morality and conscience and right conduct, and shows people that it is the duty of the citizen not to blindly support whatever the government's doing, but instead to stand firm in opposition to what the government's doing once the citizen concludes that the government is engaged in wrongdoing. So on that note, Richard, we need to wrap things up. We're out of time. As always, I enjoyed the conversation with you and look forward to talking to you next week.
Until next time, and as I always try to remember to do, I want to thank the viewers and listeners for sharing a little bit of their time with us.
Yeah, if this is your first time exposure to the Future of Freedom Foundation, come and visit us at fff.org. We've got 29 years worth of principled essays on libertarianism, including a weekly article by Richard that we publish, and along with conferences and videos and lectures and other good stuff, all presenting the principled case for liberty and libertarianism. Richard, I'll see you next week.
Till next week.